Good afternoon, folks. Just wanted to catch up with a quick discussion on Trevino's 8 steps of ethical decision making. I really like this structure because after talking about deontology, teleology, virtue ethics, and all those different philosophical approaches to making ethical judgments, Trevino and Nelson's 8-step approach is a nice comprehensive way to integrate a lot of those approaches to deciding right or wrong in these organizational ethical dilemmas, and gives us a nice mechanism by which we can make sure we make a comprehensive decision for the situation that presents itself to us. So I thought we'd walk through the 8 steps real quickly just to make sure that we're comfortable with them. And initially, as obvious as it sounds, gather the facts. Now that's pretty interesting because we very often forget to look at all the aspects of the decision, and because of that don't necessarily address or analyze all the factors that might attend this particular decision. So this is not unlike the beginning of a classical approach to the decision making, where we try and gather the facts and understand the decision scenario and work from there. The second step, define the ethical issues, and this is where we sometimes work from the idea of ethical awareness and recognize that there's an ethical content to this decision. What's the nature of the ethical content? What's the issue or the issues that we need to contend with? Is it an issue of harm? Is it an issue of fairness, justice, and equality? In any event, we want to put some parameters on the ethical issue in addition to the facts now, so that we have a factual representation of the decision scenario and a full understanding of the ethical implications associated with it. And with that in mind, then, that allows us to go on and identify who the affected parties are by the outcome of this decision. And so this is where our discussion of stakeholders comes into play. Recall our stakeholders defined as those individuals and groups in the organizational environment that can affect, or in our case, importantly now, are affected by the decisions of the organization. And so when we think of who can be affected by this, we naturally want to go into our stakeholder analysis. And this is going to help us begin to understand consequences and rights and obligations that we have once we understand who the parties are to this decision. That then allows us to work our way into the first integration of a philosophical concept into this 8-step process, and that is the consequentialist or the teleological approach. Knowing who's going to be affected, we ask the next question: how are they going to be affected? What are the consequences of our decision? And that might be as simple as a benefit or harm calculation that puts us in mind of a teleological or utilitarian approach. But be that as it may, in this 4th step, knowing who's going to be affected and now understanding how they're going to be affected puts us in a mind of a consequentialist approach. And so we're going to cover our bases there first of all. We're next then going to turn around and take a somewhat deontological approach. Well, I wonder what we owe these people. Do we have an obligation to work with them in a certain way? Do they have rights, whether contractually or implicit in our relationship, that we have to honor? And so here's the deontological approach to this ethical decision making, kind of built into an analytical framework. Step 6, well, maybe this is the virtue ethics part. Consider yourself, consider your own view of your integrity and your character. And what do you think you ought to do? What is it that seems right to you in the analysis of a choice? And so this is kind of this Aristotelian approach, where we're thinking of the virtuous nature of you, the decision maker, or we're trying to ask our decision makers to think of their integrity and the virtuous nature of them as a decision maker as well. That leads us then almost to the end here, thinking creatively about potential actions. And this seems to be a bit of a step back. We've identified a problem, and we've now gone through a couple of approaches to think about how to address it. And this is kind of a stop and think modality for Trevino and Nelson. Now that we've looked at consequences and we've thought about ourselves, let's stop and think about this one more time. Let's think if there's some other way to address this. Perhaps we don't like the outcomes. It's going to be a lot of harm associated with this. Well, have we thought about how to work our way around it? The easiest example of that is the layoff situation. We know we're going to harm a lot of people when we decide to lay 100 people off in a workforce. Might we think of another approach and say, rather than lay those 100 off, maybe we ask all 1,000 to take a pay cut. So everybody earns a little bit less, but everybody keeps their job. And so we spread the harm out on a much a more minor basis, if you will, and avoid a larger harm to those particular individuals. Last step we have, check your gut. And this is kind of this idea of a practical test for Trevino and Nelson. When we think about this decision just in our gut, does it feel right? Trust yourself is kind of the issue here. Trust how you think this is going to play out. And if it feels good from a gut perspective, from kind of an internal comfort standpoint, it might give you that final clearance that it looks okay. And the nice thing about this 8-step approach, I think, when you think about it, is it situates this idea of ethical decisions and analysis in a more classical framework. And that classical framework, while oriented towards maximizing outcomes, always departs from understanding the decision situation. That also suggests that once we understand the decision scenario, this is a nice, inclusive, comprehensive approach. Teleology is thought of. Deontological views are taken into consideration. We look to the integrity of the decision maker when we're trying to make the decision. And we bake a couple practical views into it as well. This idea of checking your gut is a classic practical approach to decision making. Nice thing about it as well is it keeps us focused on a relative theater of analysis. That is to say, we're focusing on those relevant stakeholders in the environment of the organization. So we keep our analysis and our effort focused on that which matters most directly to the organization, its own organization. And then finally, kind of a caveat here. It's presented as an 8-step approach. It suggests a linear approach to this decision. It doesn't have to be. We can kind of approach this from any number of aspects. The issue here is not so much start with 1 and work 2, 3, 4 sequentially, but make sure you cover all 8. Probably a good idea to start with analyze the decision and gather the facts, but after that, you can come at this in somewhat of a circular motion. Again, the comprehensive nature suggests when we've hit all those steps, we've probably done a nice job of covering all our bases from an ethical decision standpoint. And so there you have it. We've got a nice situation here where we've found a way to come to this ethical judgment and bring in some of the more complicated philosophical frameworks that we can use, teleology, deontology, yet embed them in a somewhat practical, somewhat ordered, maybe you want to think of it as kind of a standard operating procedure approach. Steps 1 through 8. 8 steps to a comprehensive approach to ethical decision making.